And I'd like it also to be a little bit more interactive, because this is it's a big topic, but at the same time, it's not really possible for us to, go through every corner of it. I am not going to go into interventional techniques of dealing with grief in families from a psychological perspective. This is more about laying the landscape out. And through our questions and answers and discussions, I hope that you can talk about some of the challenges that you have in your own practice, and maybe we can take it on a case-to-case basis like that. Also, like Senior said, we will split it across two different sessions. So it's not going to be a clean cut of grief in this session and bereavement in the next, but we'll just sort of free flow through the two sessions. And I'm actually quite glad, I'm happy to have you all also determine the pace. So before we get into this big topic, I'm going to ask, and I'm going to ask all of you to participate in this. You don't have to unmute or anything, but it'll help me to understand how deep I can go into this topic based on what the general emotional temperature in the room is. I often find that grief and bereavement is a triggering subject, especially if people have experienced it themselves. So in the chat box, I'd like a word from each of you, a feeling word, not a cognitive word. Just do a quick body scan if you want. If you're feeling heavy, you can say heavy. If you're feeling disoriented, if you're feeling, tired, if you're feeling whatever, I'm not going to give you any more words, but I really would like to know where this group is at before I go into the session. And so help me out here. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do this. It can be a phrase. Regulated, I'm going to use that word. If you don't want to share with the larger group, you can send me a private message. I especially want to know if anyone is feeling particularly fragile emotionally at the moment, because it's important. It's important for me to know that. Okay. There are 31 people here, so 29, not including Senior and I. So I'd like about 29 answers, please. Senior, my math is very bad. So how many, we still have more than half the group still has to respond.
I'm requesting all to turn on your videos.
Just for this bit.
Yes. At least for a while.
Afternoons are really sleepy for me as well, Genevieve. And talking about grief after eating a big plate of rice is really difficult. But let's do it.
I think otherwise we would assume that they are not here. This is black mark. So yeah.
Yeah. All right.
So please.
All right. Keep them coming. Keep them coming. It's just honest answers. The reason I'm also asking you to share this with me is there will be certain times in these sessions it is important for me to know this. Also, like certain parts of the session, I will do a trigger warning because if some of you are not feeling too good because you've experienced a recent loss or because you're just overwhelmed with work or whatever, I will ask you in that moment to check out and come back in 5 minutes, because this class is not supposed to be one that inflicts more stress on you. It is a learning class, but the tendency for me is to go into an immersive learning experience. So if you are feeling fragile, I will take a moment to say we're going to be doing this. You're welcome to take a little bit of a walk around and come back. Okay. All right. So let's get into it. I think everybody here has experienced grief in some form or the other. I'm making a very broad stroke assumption. We are human. If you're human, you've experienced grief. And so I'm going to say that in that regard, all of us are a community, and the nature of grief probably that is experienced is different from person to person, depending on circumstance. I'm also very mindful of the fact that we have just come out on the other side of a pandemic, and I'm not sure how many people here have been affected very deeply by it. So again, fair warnings, but if you are feeling a little overwhelmed, you can, message me directly and during the course of the session, and you can step out for a few minutes and come back. Okay. So let's start with the fact that grief is a universal experience. And first and foremost, what we really want to talk about is the fact that grief and rituals of mourning are healthy adaptations to loss. It is not a pathological thing. Grief is not a pathological thing. It is a healthy adaptation. My apologies. A healthy adaptation to loss. And we will talk a little bit about rituals of mourning. So let's stop here. Can you tell me what are some of the rituals of mourning that come from your communities? I'm part Nepalese, and in our Nepali culture, we have a lot of little rituals that we have after the person has passed away. Rituals around food, rituals around what we understand to be their next rebirth form. There's rituals around, things like how do we support one another in terms of what roles that we take. Fifth day puja, yeah. Memorial services. What are some of the more individual rituals that people have within smaller communities? Simple sattvic food, yeah. I remember going 13 days without salt, and I found that terribly difficult as a young person. 13th day puja, yeah. So a lot of prayer services. But do you know of any particular rituals within these prayer services? Keeping food for the soul outside the house. Yes, yeah, that's also something that we have. Don't leave the body alone right after death. Stay close praying. Yes. Okay. Now, there is also rituals around bathing the body, right? Who gets to participate in those rituals? Which member of the family is asked to do it? Even during the funeral, different family members have different roles and so on and so forth. And these are all rituals that have emerged over centuries, and they do serve a purpose. It is to bring people closer together. It's to bring people to alleviate the burden on just one person who is grieving. And it's really about community coming together to support the family. This is something that we didn't have during COVID. And that has resulted in a huge amount of mental health issues as well for a lot of people, because many of us had to grieve alone because of the strict isolation laws. So I would say that amongst the many changes that have happened in the last 2 years, the pandemic has also changed a lot of ways in which we interacted. And this was very hard on us. And I think that the thing that came home to me was the fact that, things that I took for granted earlier were really just suddenly became conspicuous by their absence during the pandemic. And I think the experience of grief completely shifted worldwide. So what we're going to talk about today are the more normative experiences of grief. But sure, let's pause from time to time and see if that has changed in COVID years. Okay. So first of all, it's a healthy adaptation to loss. And so the main thing about grief is that it is centered around loss. People grieve when they lose something that they value, and it's not just a person. It could be many other things as well. Now, you want to help me out? What are some of the types of losses? Now, we're talking now specifically in the context of palliative care. So I'm going to ask you to bring your mind back to what are some of the losses that people who have been diagnosed with an illness face in the course of their illness trajectory, not just the patient, but also the family. So what are some of the types of losses that are experienced when when a disease diagnosis is made? Loss of autonomy. Yes, Hadas. What else? Mobility. Yeah. Routine. Yeah. Some of us are very comforted by routine. Peace of mind, big one. Yes. Loss of money. Loss of work. Friendship. Loss of your old self. Yes. Loss of daily activities, relational changes, financial. Okay. You guys can just take this class. I don't need to really emphasize anymore. All right, so great, loss of social context. Right, so maybe what I'm putting on the screen is just a different way of saying something that you have already said in the chat box, yeah? So identity and customary roles. Who are you? I'm asking you this question right now as a group, to each and individual person. Who are you? If I were to ask you, who are you? And I'm just calling out random names that I'm seeing on the screen, yeah? Tanvi, Mr. Joshi, Preeti, Sarita, Abhishek. If I ask you, who are you? How will you answer that question? Some of you might respond by talking about the professional role that you have. I'm a teacher, I'm a counselor, I'm a doctor. Some of you might refer to the relational roles that you have. I'm a mother, I'm a sister, yeah, a grandfather, yeah. And the first loss usually that is experienced by a patient is the loss of your identity. And this is very typical of the healthcare setup we have here, where very often people just become case file numbers, or they are identified by their disease or the department they're visiting, right? And usually the diagnosis of a serious, I love that, I'm a traveler on a journey, great. So usually the disease diagnosis reduces a person to either, something to do with the disease itself. And in the case of a serious diagnosis, people do lose their jobs, people do have to, quit their professions, they have to be at home. And it's made worse by the fact that the family itself, even though well-intentioned, will start treating the person like a patient. And it's born out of love, but suddenly, no, let me get that glass of water for you. No, let me do this. You rest, you relax. So even if the person can do certain things for themselves, with a lot of love, the family strips away that bit of autonomy and identity and that role. And customary roles like being the mother, being the nurturer in the family, being the one who, resolves fights, being the one who people come and confide in, being the one who is expected to solve a problem. And suddenly all of those roles are also taken away because everything is disease focused. So one of the biggest losses that people experience is their identity and the customary roles that they play within their own families. Physical function, someone talked about mobility. Yeah, mobility is a part of physical function, but you could lose other physical functions as well, right? For some people, they might lose a sense organ, they might not be able to see, they might be blinded. For some people, it might be, other deficits that come up that are a result of the illness. There are people who just are so fatigued that they can't do the things that they used to be able to do earlier. So loss of physical function is a loss. Relationships, someone talked about social context. Why would relationships be lost when there is a disease diagnosis? What sort of relationships are lost at this point? What kind of relationships would you lose? Maybe friends due to lack of mobility. Yes. Intimate Relationships, yes. Mentoring relationships, social, role of a mother or father, intimacy, yeah. Yeah, so a lot of you are talking about intimacy. Also the fact that, some diseases are so disfiguring that people don't want to be seen. Like a lot of head and neck cancers, a lot of patients with head and neck cancer prefer, you'll see a decline in their social activity. You might have just, maybe neighbors coming across to see you, friends coming across to see you, but they're awkward about what to say to you. They don't know what to say to you. And after a while, that interaction itself becomes a little bit difficult, and then they stop visiting. And lots of people just don't know what to say, right? And of course, there's relationships that are lost because you simply cannot travel anymore. You can't maintain those relationships, and the nature of the relationship changes, and it feels more like a loss. Okay, material and economic, like someone said, financial. So again, we know that being sick in India is a very, very expensive affair, and being sick in a lot of places is, but the material losses, you have to mortgage your house, you might have to sell something in order to have enough money to pay for certain treatments. You have to give up on certain things, certain, maybe some lifestyle related gadgets and stuff that you earlier had, or something that you've been saving for that you can't buy anymore, right? So there's a lot of material and economic losses as well. Maybe you were saving up to buy your dream house. I know a lot of people who've had to give up on that dream because somebody in the family got sick. And that is a huge loss, isn't it? Okay, the loss of time. If any of you have been carers, or you've experienced serious illness, you know how much of your time goes in just planning that care, going to the hospital, making appointments, time in the waiting room, and so many things, so many hours in your day just goes into those things, hospital related stuff, medical related stuff, consultations, appointments, and all of that time which you earlier had to do other things is gone. And of course, there is the loss of time in terms of just time span, lifespan. Yeah. I don't know anymore if I'm going to be alive for my daughter's wedding. I don't know if I'm going to be alive anymore for something else that I was hoping to be alive for. So there is that loss of time. There's loss of opportunity. How do you lose opportunity? Because suddenly your illness, now you can't do the things that you had planned for, right? Maybe a child in the family can no longer go to study in the college that they wanted to. Maybe someone was about to take a job in another city, but now they can't take that job because they have to stay at home and care for the person who's sick. Maybe, you were up for a promotion just before you got the diagnosis. So many opportunities are also lost. Plans. Let me take you all back to 2020 February. What plans did you have in February 2020? And what has happened to those plans 2 years down the line? So disease and illness can be extremely derailing. You can't stick to your plans. Nothing, you can't plan anything more except, you have to go from one review meeting to another, see where the disease is, and then you can make the next plan, really. Oh, can we go on a holiday in December? I don't know. Let's see what the scans show us, if we're okay to do that. So a lot of plans are also derailed. Some of you, the first word that came into the chat box is autonomy. It's a big one. It's a big one. Suddenly the patient is the recipient of everybody else's instructions and decision making. They no longer have control over what they want in life. And yes, very few families have that ability to have that shared decision making going on. And while there might be consensus within the family, like, okay, my mother and I know exactly what's good for her, what she wants, we've discussed it. But the doctor may not agree. The hospital may not agree. So even though within the family there is consensus, the autonomy might be taken away from me by the system. Yeah. Control, it ties into autonomy as well. You've lost control. Nothing seems like it's in control anymore. And I see this very poignantly in a lot of carers who I work with who are in their 30s and 40s, where they're dealing with their elderly parents. And they're like, God, he's become so stubborn, and he just just won't. Now he wants to watch this program no matter what, or he wants to, he's so obsessed with this little thing that he does every evening. And if he doesn't do it, he gets really angry. A lot of my time goes into discovering or, exploring with them what else has been taken away in terms of control from the parent. And these are little ways in which the parent is trying to reassert control in their lives. And sometimes they do it in a very obsessive, frustratingly obsessive way for the carer. What we see this, and it's not just in elderly people, it's across demographics. When somebody is sick and control has been taken away from them, you might find that they become very, very stubborn about small things. It's because it's only there they can exert any sort of control anymore. Okay, and dignity, very big one. Disease strips us of our dignity, not just in terms of how we lose control over our bodies, but also in terms of how we are in this imbalanced power dynamic with the healthcare system. And, you might be whoever you are, but you always enter the healthcare system when you're in a time of vulnerability as a patient, and you're already vulnerable, you're already sick. And at that point in time, very often, the dignity of a person is really not the center of attention. And dignity is conveyed in different ways. How do I show you that your dignity means something to me? It's the way in which I talk to you, the way in which I address you, the way in which I invite you to be part of the decision-making process. And a lot of that is lacking in today's system. So by the time patients come around to us in Pallium India, we find that they are so bereft of dignity by the end of it, or it's been taken away from them, that a simple act like, showing them respect, asking what the caregiver's name is, wanting to know more about how they feel about the disease, etc., etc. It is such a dignity restoring practice, and it's so new to them. It's so sad how new this whole practice is to them, that it becomes a little bit, it's overwhelming for them, but then it's probably the first time they've experienced it in years of being patients. So dignity is a big one. Now, each of these things that we're talking about, and of course, a functioning member in the family. We lose a functioning member in the family, whoever is sick, no matter who is sick. Yeah. Each of these things that I've just taken you through, don't each of them deserve grief as a response if you lose it? You would grieve, right, if you lost your ability to drive, because your independence and sense of autonomy was tied to that. You would grieve the loss of a house that you were dreaming of. You would grieve the loss of not being able to go and study just because somebody in the family is sick. You would grieve all of these different losses. So grief is not something that is only reserved for death and dying. So in the course of the treatment and illness trajectory, we suffer tremendous amounts of grief. Small things might happen, but they all accumulate. And so grief is such an intrinsic part of the entire illness trajectory. It's not something that is reserved only after the patient dies. So grief is also a total human experience. And let me just go through this one by one. Now, let's talk about physical. Huh? If I were to ask you right now, if you recall how you feel when you are grieving, where do you feel the sadness? Where do you feel the heaviness when you're sad or when you're grieving? For different people, it's different things. Chest, stomach, chest and stomach. Yeah. Okay. Headaches. Yeah. Head. Okay, lump in the throat. Now we're getting more specific. What do you feel in the chest? Tired in the whole body. Yeah. So heaviness in the chest. Yeah. So shall we all agree that grief is felt physically? Yeah. As is every emotion. So for me, when I'm stressed, I know because my shoulders get knotted up. When I'm tense, I know because my jaw is clenched. When I'm grieving, yeah, like a lot of you, I feel it in my stomach, I feel it in my chest. And it's, like a choking tightness almost sometimes. You feel it behind your eyes. So it is a very, very, very physical thing. It's not something that is just in the emotional state. Grief is also felt cognitively. How do we feel grief cognitively? We feel cognitively because you might have difficulty paying attention. You might have difficulty concentrating. Please remember, cognition and psychological are two different things I'm talking about. Okay? So cognition, lapses in concentration, short-term memory loss, brain fog. Yeah, when you're intensely grieving, your thought process, your ability to solve problems, to make decisions, they are impaired. Okay, so grief affects us cognitively. Grief affects us spiritually, of course. Those of us, like I said, we're not just talking about religion, we're talking about meaning, loss, connection, hope. I might have a sense of hopelessness. I might lose my faith. I can't find any meaning in what is going on. Why is this happening to me? Yeah, might connect, or it could even be positive. Suddenly my spiritual connection with my friends is that much stronger. Suddenly, I understand how much support I have. So it's not only a negative thing. Grief can also bind us spiritually. It can strengthen us spiritually. Okay. Grief is also an emotional experience that we know, and grief is accompanied by a lot of different emotions. It's not just sadness, is it? What can grief also have? What are some of the other emotions that can accompany that sadness that you feel during grief? Yes, anger is a big one. And we don't like talking about anger because it's an unacceptable, emotion for a lot of people. Yeah, crying, weeping, shock, yes, silence, numbness. How about guilt? How about relief? Another thing that we don't talk about, sometimes we are relieved that the person is gone because they were suffering so much, or because we had a very conflicted relationship. Yeah. So grief, and then you feel guilty about feeling relieved. Okay. So grief is a complicated set of emotions. It's not just only sadness, which everyone thinks. It is anger, it is guilt, it is relief, it is confusion, it is so many different things. And for some people, it's just like, thank God it's happened and it's over. Okay, so it is a very complex emotional experience as well. And finally, it is a social experience, because we talked about the rituals of mourning and how it really takes a village, not just to raise people, but also to see people off. Okay, so it is a social experience. And so much of the grief that you experience has to do with how much social support you have or may not have, and who's coming forward at this point for you. All right, so it's a total human experience. Now, there are many factors that influence grief, and I'm going to not go very deep into these. Those of you who are psychologists might find it easier to, make the connections. But one is attachment styles. Okay, and attachment styles is basically how do we attach ourselves to our primary carers when we are very, very young children. And this is something that stays with us for the rest of our lives. So if my attachment style with my primary carer, who normally would be the mother or the parent, if it's a healthy attachment style where I'm raised to also have that space to make my own decisions, etc., that's one attachment style. There's avoidant attachment styles where there is some sort of conflict in that, or tension in that relationship, and I will I'm going to just recalibrate myself constantly in order to minimize conflict. So I'm not going to be authentically myself. I'm going to constantly adjust myself in order to minimize conflict. So I'm always catering to the needs of the other person. And there are overly insecure styles of attachment where people are just overly attached, where if the parent even leaves the room for a few minutes, the child is crying, there's separation anxiety, all of those things. Now, what effect does this have, or what relationship does this have with grief? Is because as you develop this style of attachment, it starts manifesting in your relationships, unless you sit and pause and have insight about it and maybe work with a therapist. But these are the attachment styles that we tend to go back to over and over again, get strengthened over a period of time. If I am overly dependent on this person that I love and that person gets sick and dies, my way of grieving and coping is going to be very different from somebody who has a healthy attachment style, where I can see that space between us. I'd see us as two separate individuals. I know that she's going to die, but I will still be able to, you know, be able to carry on by myself. I have been taught how to make those decisions for myself. I'm taught how to be an independent person emotionally. My emotions are not entirely dependent on the validation of another person. So attachment styles in the beginning of life will determine grieving styles at the end of life. Okay. And that's my opinion. But I also feel like there are lots of different, there's a lot of literature out there as well that will weigh this out to some extent. So for those of you who are interested, there's a lot of great literature out there about attachment styles. And one I recommend is Mary Ainsworth's study to just, to look at it. Of course, please remember that these are Western studies. Think about it also in the context of India, where we have joint families, where we have cousins who we call our sisters and brothers, and so that dynamic changes a little bit. Okay, how is the family structured? This is tricky. You remember we talked about genograms, right? So I'll ask you to look at the genogram again. And again, this is where the genogram becomes very helpful to draw out, because in that case, who is close to whom. So you have the parent unit, you have the children who are the sibling unit. Then you see, okay, which parent is close to which child? Are the children allies, or is there some sort of tension between them? So how is the family structured, and who is in terms of how sharp are the boundaries? Is the parent unit completely separate from the child unit? Is one parent using one child in order to sort of form an alliance against somebody else? Who is close to whom is what we are seeing. Okay, family structure, and whether or not, let me come back to the screen. Boundaries. What are the family's boundaries like, and how flexible are they in terms of managing a crisis? Are they able to take on roles from one another? Are they able to fill in for each other? Are they supportive in that sense, or do they just become completely isolated individuals when there is a crisis going on? And that really tells you how this family is going to handle the grieving process. Because if there are people who don't really come together in a crisis, then there's a problem there. Communication patterns within the family. Who talks to whom? Who goes to whom to problem solve? Who goes to whom to confide? Who is close? Who is not? Who is the one who's only issuing instructions? Who is the one who prefers not to be emotional at all? And depending on who you are in that grid, your grieving style will be different. There are people who don't grieve within the family, they go and grieve with their friends. There might be that everyone in the family is going through such a hard time because their favorite person in the family is sick, and they don't talk to one another unless she's facilitating it. So what happens to that family? Okay. And social support. Cohesive families that work well together, who are as a family engaged with their social network, or closed, isolated families who don't really interact with their social network, who are not close to their extended family, who are not close to their neighbors, who don't participate in the community, etc. So those kind of things also make a difference. So attachment style is a very, very individual thing. Family structure and communication patterns is a more familiar thing. And then how does the family work with the community is the third factor. So grief is influenced by all these different things, how someone grieves and how they express their grief. And just coming back to the attachment theory for a second, human attachment is a developmental task. Okay, as a person grows, there are certain developmental milestones and tasks that we have to achieve, right? So by year one or whatever, parents talk in months, right? So how many ever months the child should be walking. By so many months, the child should be able to do this. By this age, the child is able to, hold concrete ideas in their heads. By this age, a child is able to see the relation between different things. So how we attach to people is also a developmental task. And It's not so much how we attach, but how we handle separation from those people that really can be either leading to growth or to pathology. If I'm close to you, but I'm able to handle our separation with some degree of, healthy coping, that's good. But if I'm somebody who falls to pieces the minute I don't see you, and I'm like constantly messaging you, texting you, wanting to hear from you 15 times a day, etc., it says that it's an unhealthy pattern. So what happens if one of those people dies? I mean, the other person would really go to pieces, right? Okay, so moving on. Doka and Martin are more contemporary grief researchers. They have written lots of really interesting stuff. And one of the things I learned from them is that there are three aspects to grief. One is the experience of grief itself. How do I experience it? How do I express it? And how do I adapt to the loss? So these are the three dimensions of grief. Now, I'll talk about this a little bit more. Now, years ago, not years ago, I mean, we still talk about this. Sorry, someone's closed captions. Let me stop sharing for a second. Yeah. So typically, as we were growing up, most of us have been told, boys don't cry. Yeah. Women express their emotions more easily. It is more acceptable to see a woman crying, right? And so we had very gender stereotypical ways of looking at how to express emotion. So I might experience deep grief, but I'm not allowed to express it in the way that I want to express it. If I'm a boy, I better not cry, because somebody or the other is going to come and say, you're the man now, you have to, you have to hold it together. So then people started recognizing that this is not healthy to have it as gender stereotypes like this. So then they started talking about the expression of grief in masculine and feminine ways, saying that, okay, it's not boys don't cry, women cry, etc., etc. There are masculine ways and feminine ways. But then these guys came along and they said, no, but that is still stereotyping. So now we talk about grief in the context of intuitive and instrumental, where we take away the judgment of stereotypes in terms of gender. Intuitive ways, more energy is invested in affect, in emotion, in feeling. These are people who are spontaneously able to express their feelings. They share their inner feelings. Instrumental people tend to be more cognitive. They focus on problem solving, and they prefer to discuss the problems or the things that need to be fixed rather than talking about their feelings. So always in the aftermath of somebody's death, or even otherwise, not just death, but in the experience of any loss, you'll always find people who are more like sitting around talking about their feelings, and then there are people who are just like, no, I don't want to talk about this, let me just get this sorted out. It's not to say that the two are separate. You can have a blend. Okay, sometimes you have to blend, because you might be able to be more intuitive with your friends and family. You can't be intuitive at work. You might go to work and then you're back to problem solving mode, etc. You're still grieving, but you're able to be more focused on practical tasks. But and most of us are blended in that sense. Yeah. But how we are able to express ourselves is really important. And there are people who are not allowed to express themselves the way they are naturally feeling it. As a woman, I might be completely relieved that someone is gone, either because, it was an abusive relationship, or I was just being, financially controlled by this person, or the fact that, we just didn't get along, and or the person really suffered and the suffering is over. And if I don't sit and cry about this loss, what is likely going to happen? What's likely going to happen if I just come across as just, yeah, okay, let's move on now? What do you think is going to happen if, as a woman, that's what I decide to do? You can also unmute yourselves if you don't want to type. Get into a state of denial. Yeah, I can be tagged as a selfish or a bad person, correct? Because as a woman, I should be bawling my eyes out right now. Yeah. So the thing is, that's where the dissonance comes in. Okay, where the way I feel is not how society expects me to express it. And so I have to put on an act of some sort. And that's where the dissonance comes in. And then there's this level of inauthenticity. But by and large, we're going to be talking about grief in intuitive and instrumental ways, not male and female ways. You can please already incorporate this into your language and vocabulary, because the more people talk about it in these terms rather than masculine and feminine terms, at least we move away from those stereotypes. Now, we all know about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was the first woman ever to study, the first person ever to study death and dying and grief and bereavement. And she talks about the 5 stages of grief. Now, over the years, this 5 stages of grief has become misunderstood because it has become reductive. People think that you have to go through all 5 stages of denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. But that's not how Elizabeth Kubler-Ross meant it. It's not stages in a sequential sort of way. You can bounce between stages. You can miss a stage entirely. It's not necessary that I go through depression. I can reach acceptance and then completely go back to feeling angry all over again. There is nothing stopping me. So it's not that you have to go through these 5 stages. So if you are working with somebody who is grieving, please understand that it's okay for them to oscillate between these. It's not necessary that they have to feel everything. It is certainly not necessary that they have to feel acceptance is not the goal. Okay, it's great if they have that level of acceptance, but don't be surprised if that the next day they start bargaining again or they start feeling angry again. It's perfectly fine. Now, I'm going to move on to some of 2 studies that are of a more modern framework beyond what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said. One is the grief as it's a 2-dimensional process. This is a study by Strebe and Schutt, and they believe that there is 2 things happening when someone is grieving. One is that they're dealing with the loss, which is loss orientation. And at the same time, they are also focusing on re-engaging with life. Okay. And initially, it might be more loss oriented, where you're just dealing with the loss, you're feeling that distress of grief. But over a period of time, the pendulum starts shifting more and more towards restoration, where, okay, fine, death has happened, but now I have to think about the kids going back to school. I have to think about, selling the house and moving on. I need to maybe think about what do I do with my parents' home. And that is it is still grief oriented, but at the same time, it's also restoration oriented, because you're moving to a point beyond the loss. Okay. And people will oscillate between grief and restoration for a long period of time. Ideally, it goes more and more into restoration orientation. But of course, we know that over a period of time, we have spikes of grief. And on those days, it's all loss oriented. It could be a death anniversary, it could be a birthday, it could be some other thing. So those are days when loss becomes more prominent than restoration. And the thing is that we need to give permission for that oscillation to keep expressing itself. We can't say, oh, hey, but you were doing so well. Now, why are you again going back to this? There is no stage again like that. People keep oscillating between different processes. And I particularly like William Warden's task framework, where again, he's borrowed from developmental psychology, where he says that just like a child is required to accomplish various emotional, social, physical, and mental tasks to adapt, so does a person experiencing loss, grief, and bereavement. And so I need to complete one task. This is a little bit more sequential, where he says mastery of one task impacts the mastery of a higher order task. I'll talk to you about those tasks in a second. And this is revisited and reworked over time. Again, he gives us permission to say that We might succeed at doing something, we might succeed at a particular task, but every now and then we might relapse into it, and that's okay because it takes time to get past these different tasks. And it's influenced by, he says that grief is influenced by something called the mediators of mourning, and I'll tell you that in 2 slides from now. So what are the tasks that he's talking about? First of all, you have to accept that the loss has happened. You have to accept that the loss has happened. Now, some of us are able to intellectually accept it, but not emotionally accept it. Yeah. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a second so I can see all of you. All right. So sometimes there is this thing of, yeah, I know, yeah, you know, it's better that this person is gone, who is going through such a hard time. I might say that. So it shows that I've intellectually accepted the loss. But I will leave their room just as it was for years. I won't clear out their clothes. I'll leave their chair the way they like it. So intellectually, I've accepted the loss. Emotionally, I haven't. I'm not ready to let go yet. It's fine. It's absolutely fine. It becomes a little bit pathological if I enshrine them for the next 5 years and I'm not willing to let that go. Then there is something there that I'm stuck and I haven't actually completed that task. So the first task is to accept emotionally and cognitively that yes, the loss is real. And it takes a long time for people to arrive at that, okay? The second task is work through the pain of grief. Again, this takes a lot of time. There's a saying, you know, the only way out is through. Now, somebody has gone and you have to work through that pain. And it's not just about feeling sad. I might need to work through my anger. Okay. And I might need to work through the fact that there's so much unfinished business between us. I might need to work through the fact that the last conversation I had with them didn't go well. I might have to deal with the fact that they've died and they've left me a huge mess to clean up. Bills, property issues, conflict within the family. That is all part of the grief work. So I might have that anger towards that person. And like we talked about earlier, anger is not something that we have permission to really talk about openly, right? How can you don't speak ill of the dead, right? You can. So once a person dies, they just become this untouchable hero. You can't say anything that they were flawed human beings, that, you know, so typically that's not very accepted. But then where do these feelings go? Where does this emotion go? I knew of a lady who, she had been in a pretty controlling marriage for about 50 years. And then her husband would control everything, like where she went, what she did, who she spoke to, etc., etc. And finally, a few years ago, he got diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, which is a slow, you know, I mean, for those of you who are familiar with it, you know it. It's a degenerative neuromotor disease. And over a period of time, people lose their ability to move, they lose their speech, they lose their ability to swallow, but they're all mentally still there. It's a terrible, terrible illness. And the thing is, she became his only carer, and they were wealthy enough to actually be able to afford full-time care, which is not something that everybody can do, right? So he insisted that he didn't want a nurse, he wanted her to be able, even though they could afford help. He wanted her to wait on him hand and foot. And this went on for years. And so much so that, you know, she had to hold up that board where, when he couldn't talk anymore, where he would, with his eyes, point at different alphabets for her to then sit and decipher what he wants to say. And through it all, he just kept controlling her. And when he died, what she had to deal with is now she had so much time. And she could make her own decisions, and she didn't know how to make her own decisions. And it took another 3 months of working with her before she started going for tennis classes, because that seemed like a safe thing to do. She didn't know how to go out and make friends. Then her daughters came down from the US. They introduced her to a couple of, you know, book clubs and this and that. It took another 2 years for this lady to figure herself out. And she said, I don't know what I like to eat. I don't know. So there's a whole process of discovery at the age of 60 something, I don't know, where she was finally figuring out herself, who she was without this person. So these are big tasks. And these tasks can also go on for a long time. So accepting grief, accepting the loss that has happened, it doesn't even have to be it doesn't have to be death. It has to be, suppose I lose the ability to walk. I have to accept that I can no longer walk, right? Only then I can move on to working through it. And so even with a lot of patients who we've worked with who have quadriplegia or paraplegia, getting them to accept that this is a permanent state is the most difficult thing. And you need one person to come and give you false hope and say, hey, there's this doctor over here, he does miracles. That's it, boom. You've gone back some more. And I've had the really sad experience of working with 2 children with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. And it took me 2-3 weeks to sit down with him and his mother and finally get him to understand that it's time to use the wheelchair and to learn how to use it. It was a terribly difficult conversation that took place over 2 weeks, and he finally got to it. And so we got him this really sunny wheelchair, and it was made to his size, and then he was using it, and we're like, oh, look, you can move around on your own now. Your mother doesn't have to carry you. And he did that a few times, and then he stopped, and then he cried and he cried and he cried, because at the age of 12, he suddenly realized that this was going to be his life. A month later, a junior doctor in the hospital said, hey, get that knees changed and you can walk again, and just undid everything. So so accepting the loss, working through the pain of that loss. And the third task that Warden talks to us about is to adjust to an environment where the deceased is missing. To adjust to an environment where the deceased is missing. What does this mean? This is what we call secondary losses that we experience maybe a few weeks down the line. So the initial loss happens. Everybody's busy with that. Everyone's coming to terms with it. The funeral is being planned. The funeral is being executed. The pujas are happening, all that. And then everyone leaves. And that's when the secondary losses come in, because you're like, oh my God, I don't know how to change the light bulb because this person used to do it all the time. I don't know how to, like, with what frequency to get the car serviced. It could be, I don't know how to cook. What am I going to eat and what am I going to feed the kids? For the children, it's like, who's going to drive us to school? Or if it was like an aging grandparent or something. Okay, I used to go for Diwali, every Diwali to my grandparents' house. Oh, this Diwali, that's not happening. So secondary losses that start taking place after the primary losses happened. And then you are, as a person, adjusting to the world without them. The lady I talked about, who had to refine herself after her husband died. She is also adapting to a world without this person, right? So different people have to adapt to different things. Some people have to take on more, practical roles, become an earning member of the family when they've never worked before. It was always the other person who was the breadwinner. Suddenly I have to go out and get myself a job. I haven't qualified for it. Maybe I have a bachelor's and a master's degree, but then I got married, I had kids, and I didn't work for the last 15 years. I have to go and do that now. I have to make decisions about financial planning. I don't know how to do it. I need to go get myself a chartered accountant now. I need to understand, how fixed deposits work. So it could be any number of things that I have to then adapt to in a world without that person. And this could be both good or bad. And well, I wouldn't say good or bad, but these are, there are different ways in which these manifest. And then these also, these bring up other challenges as well. Okay, and the last task that he talks about is emotionally and spiritually relocating the deceased and engaging with life. Now, this sounds like a very away with the fairies kind of statement, but what does it mean to emotionally and spiritually relocate the deceased and then re-engage with life? What do you think this statement means? So in palliative care and in grief, we have a phrase, it's called continuing bonds. Continuing bonds. What does that mean? It means that just because someone has died doesn't mean our relationship with them is over. Okay? So if your parent has died, does it mean you stop having that relationship? No. It's just in a different place spiritually. You may go back to your mother when you're sad. What would my mother have wanted me to do now? You might go back to the person who's died and say, God, like, I wish you were here to like help me figure this out. Or you might celebrate, so you might see something that reminds you of them and you want to say something to them, but they're not there. But over a period of time, they start living in a particular spiritual dimension for you, getting comfortable with the roles and responsibility. Yeah. But what I'm really trying to say is that even if the person is gone, we still have a relationship with them. Am I making sense? Is this making sense to you? Yeah? All right. You will always identify as a person's daughter, parent, whatever else it might be, whoever it is that you've lost. Now, if this is what I'm thinking about all the time, then I have not put them spiritually in a place where I can move on with my life. There will come a point where, okay, it's been 2 years, 3 years. And this is especially difficult when this is a spouse or a partner. Yeah. Or a child also. And there comes a point where, after having lost a child, the mother says, okay, I'm ready to try again. We make this mistake a lot in our healthcare system. I've seen this in our children's clinics, in the government hospital. It's really sad. A woman will come in with a child with a congenital anomaly like cerebral palsy or something, and immediately you have healthcare workers saying, have another baby, the next one will be normal. It's terribly difficult for the mother because that's not how she's experiencing it, right? Or when the child dies, it's like, okay, have another child. It's almost like saying if your pet dies, get another pet and replace it. It's not like that. It's not that easy. You have to be ready spiritually to relocate this person in a safe place and then move on. So I think the easiest thing I can tell you to do is, there is a series called Modern Love that is that's on Netflix, and there's Modern Love Mumbai, there's Modern Love all that, but the original Modern Love is a Western one where it's season 2. Episode 1, this woman has lost her husband and she's now married to somebody else, and that particular episode is really beautiful in the way it demonstrates how we relocate somebody spiritually when they die. So watch it. Maybe that'll explain it better than I have been able to explain it right now. So that's William Worden's tasks, and we're just going to go through something else now. But before we do that, because it is a little bit of a heavy thing, let's take a 1-minute break. And what I really want you to do is, kick off your shoes, put your feet on the ground, and rotate your shoulders a little bit, because I can see some of you have been sitting in the same position for a little while. Okay. And maybe you want to stretch your hands and your fingers a little bit, get some blood circulation going. Where has this session landed in you physically? See where it is and distribute that a little bit. If it's feeling a little bit heavy, you tell me it's feeling a little bit heavy. If you want to take a walk, take a quick walk around your room and come back. Okay. All right. 1 minute. Senior, please let me know. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to go into an aspect which I think for any one of us who is dealing with or supporting a person who is going through bereavement or is about to experience a loss, If there was one slide in this entire module that I would want you to keep as a cue card, it's this one. Okay, we're going to talk about the mediators of mourning. How do you help somebody who is grieving? And this is just like something that you need to keep handy. Okay, so mediators of mourning basically are these questions. Okay, 1, who died? Who died? Okay. So was it my mother? Was it my father? Was it my child? How was I attached to them? What was the nature of my attachment? I was very dependent. I relied on them to make all my decisions. They were my emotional support person. I was, whatever problems I had in life, I could always rely on this person to be my safe person. This person it's a very conflicted attachment, because on one hand, they took care of me, but on the other hand, they were very nasty to me. So I don't know, I never knew where I stood with him. A very strict father, or a very, nurturing parent, or whatever it might be. What was the type of death? Was it a long, prolonged, slow, painful death? Was it a sudden death? Was it a painful death? Was it what we call a good death, where the person died in a dignified way, with no pain, with family around them, etc.? What was the type of death? Was it a suicide? Was it an expected death, or was it an unexpected death? What is the type of death? Okay. The fourth is, how does the loss impact the person's sense of self? How does the loss impact the person's sense of self? Now, this is not stuff like, oh, she's a widow now, or, she's, or this person is now single. It's not like that. How do I see myself after losing this person? So it could be that I see myself as free. I might see myself as abandoned. I feel abandoned that this person left me. It might be that, now I'm all alone and I have nobody I can trust left in the world. It could be that my best friend is gone. I don't have I'll never have this kind of person again in my life. It could be that, thank God this person is gone and I'm feeling so much better. Okay, so how does the death impact my sense of self? There's no right or wrong, there's no good or bad. Okay, it's just how the person sees this. So when you're asking this person, how does this person's death affect you? Be mindful that you don't want the standard answers. I'm feeling sad, or it's a huge loss. No, how does it affect you as a person on a day-to-day basis? Okay, that will really tell you how you're supposed to support them as well. Okay. Next question. What are this person's previous experiences with loss? Have they experienced loss before, or is this their first loss? Yeah. For some people, they've had tremendous number of losses that they faced before. How well or badly were earlier losses handled? Very critical. What will this tell me? Anyone? What will it tell me to know how previous losses were handled? Why is this an important question? Yes, please unmute.
If they were able to cope with their earlier losses in a way which we all grieve when we lose someone, but if they were able to come out of it and adjust to it slowly, gradually, then maybe this time also they can do it. But if they handle it in a really bad way earlier, so it is just another added thing to the load they are carrying. they're already still not able to come out of that grief, or maybe let's say they had a really unhealthy way of coping with it. So another loss is just going to make it worse than it was earlier. So
Yeah.
I think that's how.
So we're looking at two things here. That's why the previous question is their first experience with loss. And like you said, it could be accumulative losses, right? Maybe I can handle loss well, but suddenly 3 people in my life have died, one after the other. I'm not expected to handle it well then. Versus if I just lost one person, maybe I lost that person badly, but if I lose 3 people, it's a whole other experience, isn't it? No matter how healthy my previous coping skills were, I'm not going to handle this one well. So what it tells me as a counselor is what are some of the maybe, trigger points for this person. I can't expect this person to go and do their tasks of, like of accepting the reality of loss and all of that when they're already dealing with so much. So that's why I'm asking this question. And how were their previous losses handled? It also will give me a hint on what they rely on as social support. Who helped them at that time? Where is that person now? It'll tell me where their resources are if they were able to handle it well. If they were not able to handle it well, like you said, I better be careful, because this person has a tendency to spin out, or this person has a tendency to, be in denial. So then my interventions and my way of working with that person will change. Yeah. And that's really important. So that's one. I'm just checking the chat box. Might throw some light on how they might be able to, yes, absolutely, adjust to an ability to bounce back. Resilience. Okay, how resilient are these people? That's another one. Another thing that this question, or the answer to this question, will tell you. The next mediator of mourning that I would like you to look at is, what is their level of social support? Remember, grief is a social experience. What is their level of social support? Do they have friends? Are they part of a church group? Are they part of another community? So this is the eco map, guys. Remember, in that assessment, fundamentals of assessment, we talked about the genogram and the eco map. This is the eco map of grief. Who do they have? Are they supported by the school that their child goes to? Are they supported by, a community that was part of their grandmother or their grandparents' community? Are they supported by extended cousins, relatives, whoever? Now, if the loss has resulted in somebody losing their home, right? Then is there enough social support in terms of social workers, people in the area who will be able to help them, right? So it's not just emotional social support, it's also practical social support. Is there somebody who can babysit their children while they take time out to grieve a little bit? Is there someone who can come in and help with their chores that they don't know how to do anymore? And also, I wanted to just share one thing, is that just going back a little bit, it just occurred to me that amongst the secondary losses is also the fact that in losing somebody, you might lose social status, you might lose financially, you might lose a massive income, right? You might lose those things as well. Those are also secondary losses. Now, if, for example, somebody has not left a will and the property is contested, and as a result of this person's death, I lose that property, that is a secondary loss. It's a big one. Okay, so the level of social support is not just who is there to emotionally support me, but it's also people who will say, okay, you know what, come, I'll tell you how to manage the bank. Come, let me drive you here. So those kind of things that you're missing in your secondary losses, that kind of social support as well. So it's very important to understand what level of social support these people have. Okay. And secondary losses caused by death. Oops, sorry, I jumped my own gun. So what are the secondary losses? We just talked about that. Secondary losses can be status, it can be material or economic or financial. It can be a role within the family, functioning member within the family, etc. Now, a counselor cannot help people with tasks of mourning without a thorough understanding of these mediators. You cannot come up with a plan of action unless you know all of this information. Each of these questions will help you fine-tune each intervention that you use. Okay, so remember that grief does not exist in a vacuum. The individual might experience a loss, but it has ripple effects through the family and the community. And we rely on each of these also to become ways in which we manage that grief. I'm also now going to just close the session with three concepts. One is anticipatory grief. Grief is not always felt after the loss. Sometimes there is grief that is felt in anticipation of a future harmful occurrence. I know this disease is progressing. I know I'm not going to live, for this particular occasion or event or whatever. I'm grieving it. I'm grieving the loss of the person even before they're gone. So anticipatory grief is a thing. It is not to be confused with depression, although they seem very similar. Okay, so anticipatory grief. And the other thing, anticipatory grief is also very closely tied to fear. Okay, I feel, so grief is felt over a loss. And when we love something, we're also afraid of losing it. So grief, loss, and fear seem to be, they seem to be in lockstep quite often. And what I'm really wanting to do with understanding anticipatory grief is I need to understand the fears of the person. What are they afraid of? They're afraid of the unknown. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what will happen to me after this person dies. Or for the person, it's what happens after death? What happens to me after I die? Do I just disappear? Do I go back to this belief system that I have? But I don't know. I really don't know. So fear of the unknown, fear of loneliness. That's something that's very common. And loneliness on both sides, both for the survivor as well as for the person. We might say we are with you, but ultimately that final journey is done alone. We walk with people till the point of death. But that final transition is an individual one. And there is a sense of, gosh, how am I going to go through this? Friends, fear of loss of friends and family. And, this is a very, we think of it from the caregiver's perspective. But I remember, when my mother was very sick, and when my adopted mom was very sick and she was dying of cancer, she went through this period of being absolutely nasty to me. She was just like, no, I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to do this. I don't want to have anything to do with you. And I was wondering, why is she behaving like this? And I was very cut up by it. But later on, I remember she threw me out of her hospital room at 2:00 in the morning, and just like that. So I was sitting outside and I was really, really upset. And I remember a nurse came up and sat down next to me, and she said, why are you sitting in the corridor and crying? I said, because my mother threw me out and I can't understand what's wrong with her. We've had such a close relationship, and now she's treating me like she's like, like she doesn't care about me. And this nurse said something very interesting. She said, you all love her a lot, yeah? I said, yeah. And she also has this close bond with all of you. I said, yeah. So, sorry, excuse me. So she says, all of you are coming to terms with the loss of one person. She's coming to terms with the loss of all of you. It's a two-way thing. And that suddenly made me realize why she's behaving like this. So that is a fear that is experienced from both sides, yeah? Okay. The other fear is loss of body function. And of course, loss of identity is a big one. I'm sorry, I'm just going to take a second to drink some water. A teacher, a mother, or whatever. And who am I if I'm not accomplishing these things, if I'm not achieving this? And also loss of identity. Like, will people remember me for who I was, or will they just remember me for this as this patient? And I've heard a lot of people say this. I don't want people to remember me like this. Okay, when I'm at my weakest and most disfigured. I want to be remembered, how I was earlier. And there's this beautiful story about this hospice where this patient had a picture of herself when she was a top athlete. She had that picture of herself in her own room. She said, no, because I need to remember who I was. So fear of loss of identity. And so anticipatory grief is working through all this. And very often, when we pinpoint the fear, when we figure out what is it that they're afraid of, we are able to unpack that fear with them. Okay. And we talked about medical anxiety versus death anxiety, where very often we think the person is afraid of death, but the person is actually afraid of how they are going to die. Are they going to suffocate? Are they going to be in pain? Are they going to feel, are they going to be delirious? Are they going to lose their dignity in front of their family and their loved ones? And when you unpack that fear and you say, what are you afraid of? And this is what you get. You are then able to reassure them and say, you know what? We have the means to relieve your pain. We have the means to relieve your breathlessness. We will ensure that it doesn't get that bad. You will not be alone. We are here whenever you need us. And so these kind of fears of loneliness, of going through this alone, of all of these things can be mitigated to a large extent if you are able to, if you have the courage to sit with them and ask them what their fear is. And a lot of this anxiety goes away. A lot of this fear and anticipatory grief also goes away. And you can actually reframe it to say, okay, if you're afraid to do this, then if you're afraid that this is going to happen, what would you like to happen? And then they're expressing their wishes to you. And then you have more to work with, okay? And we're just going to talk a little bit about complicated grief. I don't want to belabor complicated grief too much because it is a huge subject. It is basically, you can find a lot of literature on this, but complicated grief is basically grief that doesn't go away. And it's so overwhelming and overpowering that it starts interfering with your daily living. You're not able to think past the person who has died. You're not able to get out of that grieving state, that acute grieving state for a long time. And it completely dominates and overshadows life. That's the kind of grief it is. There are three things that typically determine, or are indicators of how complicated grief happens. One is the nature of the relationship with the deceased person. Again, I'm going back to attachment and the kind of relationship you have. Overly dependent, very, very enmeshed relationship, one not being able to function without the other, so on. Or it could be a very dominating relationship, someone who dominated your life. It could be someone that you were heavily financially dependent on, and so on and so forth. The second determinant is the circumstances of the death. Okay. Sudden death, unexpected death, so on and so forth. Now, again, remember the mediators of mourning that I told you about? You're asking this question, right? So that also tells you whether this person is a high risk for complicated grief. Okay. Now, circumstances of death, easy for me to reach an example is COVID. It's the most recent and biggest example I can give you, where the circumstances of so many people's death was so bizarre. They were fine one day, they developed symptoms, they went to the hospital, we never saw them again. And one of the, something I read is one of the most terrible griefs is the grief over the disappeared. People just disappeared, right? We didn't even get to sit with them in the hospital. We didn't get to see them or mourn them or do funeral rituals, mourning rituals. That is a very, very bizarre set of circumstances, right? People just disappeared. Other circumstances could be an overdose of a drug. It could be, choosing to end your life or committing, we don't call it committing suicide, but death by suicide. And all of these things also lend themselves to complicated grief, which is why we have to recognize that the pandemic, the major waves might be over. I mean, there's a new one coming, I know, but But what we are really facing now is a pandemic of complicated grief that nobody is talking about. There are lots of people experiencing complicated grief, and that is something we need to remember. Yeah, there is no closure for people who went missing. Accidental death, yes, that's also that's a circumstance as well that would warrant complicated grief. The last is events that occurred after the death. Okay, I took care of this person for a long time, he died. After his death, my life has fallen apart. Either because I don't have family anymore, or that this person was my protector. Now suddenly I'm not protected. This person could have been the gentle, loving person in my life who just I went to for everything. Or it could be the fact that this person died and left me a big old mess. I suddenly have to pay off all these debts. I didn't know that their business was so badly off that the people are coming to collect on these debts. I'm having to sell stuff in order to settle these problems, financial issues, and that complicates my grief. I think, how did this person allow this to happen? So that's also that can also be one way in which complicated grief manifests. Finally, very, very poignant kind of grief is disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief. It is grief that is considered unacceptable by others. Grief that is considered unacceptable by others. What kind of grief is unacceptable? What kind of grief is unacceptable? Oh God, Musabia, I'm so sorry. I just read your message. Still worth, yes. What other grief is not acceptable, or is not accepted, or is not given that space that other kinds of grief? Loss of a pet, yeah, absolutely. For some people, pets are family. But then someone will come and say, oh, get yourself another dog. What other kinds of grief are not accepted? Loss of a child. Samir, do you feel that? Like, do you feel that people don't empathize with people who have lost a child? Miscarriage. Thank you, Vaishali. Okay, so let's just get to it. Grieving for an abusive partner or parent. Yes. Also, when you've divorced somebody, and then that person dies. Recently, we had this experience where this woman was like, I lived with a man for 20 years. We got divorced, but at his funeral, I was not even allowed to, express my grief. Why? Because we had decided to get divorced. That's disenfranchised grief. Yeah, absolutely. Also very important is grief. The relationship is not recognized by society, or society didn't know you had a relationship. It could be a clandestine relationship, or it could be in our, we know in India, intercaste, interreligious. So a lot of the times those relationships are kept under wraps. It could be a homosexual relationship. It could be a same-sex relationship. It could be a queer relationship that is not accepted by society. So then when one person dies, you are not allowed to grieve that person. And the way the person died is not as supported as in some cases. For instance, we know that suicide is considered a sin, or people who have ended their lives by suicide are not even allowed to be buried in the same cremation, in the same funeral grounds and so on. Drug overdose. And I think I can't help but think, when I read about all these different shootings that happen in schools and stuff like that in the US, that you constantly hear about these things, the parents of that shooter, at the end of the day, they've also lost a child, or the family of somebody who's committed an act of terrorism. What about, that's also disenfranchised grief. Nobody supports them in that. And also it's experience when it's not a person, like one of you said, beloved animals, failed marriage, unfulfilled dreams, financial loss. If you look at all those other losses that we talked about right in the beginning of this session, we talked about loss of opportunity, the loss of material stuff, whatever. In the face of looking after somebody who is very sick, we are not allowed to express our grief sometimes over other losses. okay, you lost your job or you lost the chance to go to this college to study, but hey, listen, this person here is really sick. So your loss doesn't mean as much as what they are going through. A lot of caregivers go through that, where they diminish, their experience is diminished because the disease is so much bigger. That's also disenfranchised grief. And one thing I want to say, a big group that experiences disenfranchised grief are healthcare workers. You experience loss, you experience all this tragedy and trauma, but you're supposed to just pull up your boots and get right back to work. And you are not given time off to grieve for yourselves, for your patients, for your colleagues. And that is disenfranchised grief. I'm going to stop with that today. I just want to take these last 5 minutes to check in with the group again. If anything was a little bit too heavy for you, or if it's struck a sore nerve, please write to me and I will be happy to debrief with you. This is not an easy subject, and I don't want it to cause you more distress than you're already experiencing. So, Senia, please share my email address. I am available for any debriefing that anybody needs to do. It may not be in the next couple of days, but certainly we will talk about it. So next week we will continue this. I will leave a lot more space and time in the next session for us to discuss this more. If anything has sat with you particularly and you want to discuss it, please make a note of it. Please bring it to the next session. And I'm going to set aside at least, half an hour for us to just have an
Ma'am. I lost her. Ma'am, can you hear me? I think she is struggling with some network issues. Let's wait for a moment for her to join us.
Sorry, I dropped out, but
Yes, ma'am. We lost you in between.
What I was saying is I'd like everybody to please bring 12 chips of paper. We're going to do an exercise next week, and I don't want to spend too much time while we start the session for you to go scrambling for that. So 12 pieces of paper, don't have to be too big, just small, one A4 size sheet cut into 12 pieces. Thank you very much. And yeah, I'm putting my email ID in my email address in the chat box.
I have shared it, ma'am.
Oh, great. Okay, fine. I just thought somebody else asked. All right. Thank you. Look after yourselves and have a good weekend.
Thank you so much for ma'am joining us today. It was indeed a heavy, long session. Thank you so much all for joining us today. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye. We'll see you on the next session on Wednesday on the second part of grief and bereavement.